Tonight, we follow the trail of a secret buried not in darkness, but in sunlight. A truth carved into temples older than time. A wisdom so ancient, it survived floods, fire, and empire, only to be hidden by the very institution sworn to preserve the light. The Vatican. These were not just Egyptian myths, they were codes, blueprints, maps of the body and soul, passed down through hieroglyphs and stone. But when Rome took Egypt and the church rose from its ashes, something began to vanish. Manuscripts disappeared. Obelisks were uprooted, temples sealed, and over centuries the truth was rewritten. Why would a Christian power so obsessed with salvation go to such lengths to erase the past of another civilization, unless that past held something more, something divine, something dangerous? Some say there are scrolls beneath the Vatican, older than the Bible itself, that Egyptian rituals were not primitive superstition, but a science of consciousness, that the eye of Horus did not watch from the heavens, but from within, and that long before the Gospels there was already a path to resurrection, one the Church did not invent, but inherited. Those who tried to expose this were silenced, their findings buried, their names forgotten, and yet the symbols remain, on papal robes, in cathedral ceilings, etched into stone, where only the initiated still understand. So, before we go any further, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, because what we uncover tonight may not just change how you see Egypt, it may change how you see the world. They say the desert keeps secrets better than stone, that beneath the endless waves of golden sand, something ancient waits. Not a tomb, not a treasure, but a library, a forgotten sanctuary of scrolls, older than the pyramids, older even than the pharaohs themselves. A place whispered about in the oldest stories, guarded by time, silence, and something far more deliberate. This isn't just a myth passed down through folklore. For centuries, travellers have spoken of strange ruins buried near the edge of the Sahara. Stories of sealed chambers, carved into bedrock, where the air feels too still and the walls are etched, not with names of kings, but with symbols no one can read. Some claim it was the library of Thoth, the god of wisdom. Others say it belonged to a civilization so advanced, history had to forget it. But why would a library be buried? Why would knowledge be hidden in a place where no one could find it, unless someone wanted it that way? The legend goes like this. Thousands of years ago, long before the first dynasty rose on the banks of the Nile, there existed a city of light, not built from gold or stone, but from knowledge. Its priests were astronomers, its architects understood energy, its scribes recorded truths that would one day challenge the world, and when they saw the darkness coming, they did the only thing they could. They buried it, locked it beneath the earth, sealed by fire and sand, waiting for a time when it could be understood again. The strange thing is, the Vatican has never spoken about this. Yet, their own expeditions into Egypt, funded by quiet money and led by Jesuit scholars, always seem to drift close to those rumoured sites. Always close, never public. The few archaeologists who hinted at these discoveries had their work quietly discredited. Some vanished entirely, no press, no follow-up, just silence. And silence is where the truth usually hides. Satellite images taken in the early 2000s revealed symmetrical shapes under the desert surface, not natural formations, geometric, aligned with celestial coordinates. Buried chambers that no one has ever excavated. But the data was pulled, funding disappeared, permissions revoked. Why? What could be inside that library? Some say the scrolls detail the origins of humanity. Others claim they contain maps of the stars, as they were seen not thousands, but tens of thousands of years ago. Still others believe they hold the lost science of energy and consciousness, things modern physics is only beginning to understand. If that is true, then the Vatican's silence is not passive, it is protective. Because if the world were to rediscover what lies beneath the sand, we might realize that our story didn't begin where we think it did, and that those who claimed to bring us the light may have only been hiding a greater one all along. The desert forgets nothing, it only waits. Long before statues were carved and temples were built, the people of ancient Egypt told stories. Not just stories of animals and crops and floods, but of beings who came from the stars or from beyond the veil of death. They weren't just gods. They walked among humans, taught them, lived beside them, and then they vanished. Names like Osiris, Thoth, and Isis still echo through history, always painted with a brush of myth and magic. But what if they were never meant to be worshipped as unreachable gods? What if they were something else entirely? Guides, mentors, beings with knowledge so far beyond what early humans could comprehend that the only way to describe them was divine. Every culture has these stories. In Sumer, they were the Anunnaki. In India, the Devas. In Greece, the Titans. But in Egypt, they came with tools of light. They taught writing. They measured the stars. They showed how to build with stone in ways we still don't fully understand. And most importantly, they shared something deeper, a blueprint for human transformation. The gods of Egypt weren't just powerful, they were wise. Thoth, for example, wasn't a warlord or a thunder thrower. He was the keeper of knowledge, the one who gave language and numbers to humanity. Osiris wasn't just the ruler of the dead. He was the symbol of rebirth and the cycle of spiritual awakening. These stories weren't about bowing down, they were about rising up. But something changed. As time passed, the memory of these beings was reshaped. Instead of being remembered as teachers, they became worshipped as gods. Their lessons were turned into rituals, their names became prayers. And slowly, the idea that humans could be like them, wise, enlightened, powerful in spirit, was forgotten. This shift wasn't an accident. When a society starts to believe its own people can become divine, it creates a dangerous kind of freedom. People begin to think for themselves. They stop needing temples. They stop needing priests. That kind of thinking was a threat. So the image of these beings was rewritten, not by the Egyptians. But later, when new powers rose, powers that needed control more than truth, the Vatican has long denied any connection between ancient Egyptian spirituality and Christianity. But when you look closely, the fingerprints are everywhere. The concept of resurrection, the Sacred Heart, the Holy Trinity, the Virgin Mother, all of it has older roots, Egyptian roots, hidden beneath layers of doctrine. And perhaps that's why these ancient figures were pushed into the category of myth. Because if people truly understood who they were and what they represented, the entire idea of needing an outside authority to access the divine would fall apart. The gods that walked among men weren't there to be worshipped. They came to awaken. And maybe their greatest secret was this, that the divine isn't above us, it's already within us, waiting to be remembered. When most people think of ancient Egyptian temples, they imagine priests in white robes, incense smoke rising, and people kneeling in worship before statues of gods. But what if that was only the surface? What if behind the chants and rituals, those temples were hiding something much more advanced? A science so old and precise that it still puzzles modern researchers today. Egyptian temples were not built at random. They were aligned perfectly with stars, planets, and solar events. The Temple of Karnak, for example, is designed so that on the winter solstice, the rising sun shines straight through its central axis. That is not an accident. That is astronomy. And it means the builders of these structures understood the movements of the heavens with astonishing accuracy. Some temples were even tuned to sound. Inside certain chambers, whispers bounce in strange ways, and deep tones create powerful vibrations. It is as if the stone itself was shaped to respond to specific frequencies, not for music, but for healing, or maybe something even more mysterious. Sound and resonance may have been tools in a kind of science we no longer understand. Inscriptions on the walls do not just speak of gods, they speak of energy, of balance, of something called Mart, which means universal harmony. These were not just prayers, they were equations, blueprints for how the world works, but not in the way a textbook explains. The science of the temples was connected to the body, the mind, and the stars. Everything was linked. There are carvings in Dendera that show what looks like electrical devices, figures holding tubes that resemble light bulbs. Scholars laugh at the idea. They call it symbolism. But if these temples were really sacred science centers, maybe the Egyptians were preserving more than myths. Maybe they were keeping the memory of an older technology, one that worked with nature, not against it. The temples were built with massive stones, placed so precisely we still struggle to explain how. No crane today could lift and place them with that level of perfection, and yet they stand, thousands of years later, aligned to the stars, vibrating with silent knowledge. The Vatican has always presented Egypt as a civilization of mystery and myth, but they have preserved many Egyptian artifacts in their own museums, far from public view. Some believe certain scrolls describing temple science were taken from desert sites during early expeditions and never returned. The question is why? If the temples contain lost knowledge about sound, light, energy, and the human spirit, then understanding them fully would shake more than history. It would challenge everything we think we know about who we are and what we are capable of. And it would prove that the people of ancient Egypt were not just worshippers, they were scientists, engineers, masters of a kind of wisdom that has been quietly erased. The temples are not ruins, they are messages, still standing, still waiting to be read. To most people, hieroglyphs look like a strange mix of birds, eyes, suns, and people with animal heads. A lost language carved into ancient walls, something exotic and unreadable. But what if those symbols were never meant to be just read? What if they were meant to be experienced? Understood not with the mind alone, but with something deeper. For centuries, scholars treated hieroglyphs like a dead language. They focused on names of pharaohs, dates of battles, records of offerings. But hidden beneath those surface meanings was something else. A second layer. Then a third. And maybe more. The deeper you look, the more you realize that hieroglyphs were not just a writing system, they were a code. A living map of how the Egyptians saw the universe and themselves within it. Each symbol held multiple meanings. The Eye of Horus was not just about sight. It represented perception, healing, measurement, and even fractions used in ancient math. The scarab beetle was not just an insect. It symbolized rebirth, movement of the sun, and the cycle of consciousness. These were not decorations, they were instructions, lessons, reminders. Some of the texts found in tombs and temples describe the journey of the soul after death. But if you read between the lines, they are not just about what happens after life. They describe what happens within life. The organs, the chakras, the flow of energy in the body. It is as if the Egyptians mapped human anatomy through symbols, a spiritual biology hidden in art. Other inscriptions follow the stars. Temple walls track the movements of Sirius, Orion, and other constellations with precision. Some scholars now believe the positioning of hieroglyphic texts was designed to mirror the sky. What was above had to match what was written below. That kind of design takes knowledge, patience, and purpose. So, why were these meanings forgotten? Why do modern textbooks only mention the myths and not the science? The answer may lie in who got to tell the story. When Egypt fell and new powers rose, the sacred knowledge of the hieroglyphs was labelled as pagan, dangerous. And when the early church gained influence, many of these writings were declared heretical and locked away. The Vatican today owns thousands of Egyptian manuscripts, statues, and stone fragments. Some are displayed, most are not. And it is no secret that during the time of the Roman Empire, many temples were stripped and their contents shipped back to the centre of religious control. Not to share them, but to seal them. Because if people realised that ancient hieroglyphs taught spiritual awakening, advanced medicine, and celestial knowledge, it would shatter the idea that true wisdom only came through one path or one book. It would mean that long before organised religion, there was already a way to reach the divine. Hieroglyphs were never just language. They were a mirror, reflecting the mind, the stars, and the soul. And if we learn how to read them again, we might just remember who we used to be. Most people think ancient maps were simple drawings. Rivers, mountains, maybe a few cities sketched out by hand. But Egyptian maps were something else entirely. They were cosmic, spiritual, and possibly the last remaining clues to a world that existed before the flood. The Nile was not just a river, it was a spine, a sacred path that mirrored the Milky Way. To the Egyptians, it connected earth and sky, life and death. And along its banks, they placed their temples, cities, and tombs with precision that even modern GPS would struggle to match. But when researchers began to study the few surviving Egyptian maps, they noticed something strange. Some of them showed coastlines that should not exist, islands that are no longer there, mountain ranges now buried by sand. One set of fragments discovered in a forgotten archive hinted at a land far beyond the Nile, a continent that should not have been known. Its markings suggested not just terrain, but knowledge of the stars. Star maps overlaid with earth maps. As if the Egyptians understood that geography was not only physical, but energetic. Other ancient scrolls speak of a place that came before Egypt, a place swallowed by water, not myth, not fiction, but recorded memory. Some of these documents were once stored in the Library of Alexandria. That library was the largest collection of ancient knowledge ever assembled until it burned, or, more accurately, was erased. Few people know that Egyptian priests had a system of map-making that involved astronomical alignment. They used the rising of Sirius to time the flooding of the Nile, but they also used the stars to measure land and chart unknown territories. This was not primitive. This was advanced surveying based on principles we still use today. The question is, how did they learn it? And where did that knowledge come from? In the early days of colonial exploration, several European scholars brought back copies of ancient Egyptian charts. Many were incomplete. Some were confiscated. A few ended up in the hands of the Vatican, quietly stored away, not studied, not translated, just sealed. Why? Because if these maps are correct, they suggest that Egypt did not just rise on its own. It inherited something, a legacy from a civilization that came before, one that was washed away by rising seas and time, a world we are told never existed. Modern satellite images now reveal structures beneath the sands of Egypt that were once near water. Cities lost, temples forgotten, aligned to stars that no longer match their positions today, which means they were built under a different sky. And if Egypt knew about lands and people that existed before the flood, before recorded time, then our entire timeline must be questioned. The forbidden maps of the Nile are not just about geography, they are about memory, about what the world used to be before it was rewritten. They tell a story we were never meant to find, but the river remembers, and so do the stars. Walk into the Great Pyramid and speak in a whisper. The walls seem to catch your words and carry them, not echo, not bounce, carry. The sound behaves in a way that should not make sense for a structure made thousands of years ago. But maybe that is the point. Maybe it was never meant to make sense to modern ears. What if the ancient Egyptians were not just building tombs or temples? What if they were tuning instruments, structures designed to work with sound, not by accident but on purpose, stone by stone, frequency by frequency? Inside the king's chamber, the granite box, often called a sarcophagus, is made from a single block of red granite. It hums when you strike it, not loudly, but with a deep, rich vibration. The chamber around it amplifies that hum. Some researchers believe this was not symbolic, it was scientific. The room itself may have been built to enhance certain sound frequencies, and not just for music, for healing, for altering consciousness. Sound is more than just noise, it is energy. And ancient civilizations knew this. In fact, they may have understood it better than we do now. Certain tones can change how water molecules move. They can affect brainwaves. They can even shape sand into patterns. This is not theory, it is science. But the Egyptians were using it long before it had a name. Some believe the Great Pyramid acted like a massive resonator, a device that could channel and focus sound energy. The shafts inside it may have been designed to direct vibrations, not just for ceremony, but for something more powerful. Imagine a machine that could balance the body simply by sound. No wires, no drugs, just frequency. That is what some say the ancients were doing. There are stories of people who have spent time in these chambers feeling tingling sensations, hearing tones that no one else can hear, even seeing flashes of light with their eyes closed. Not magic, not imagination. Maybe they were experiencing the original purpose of the pyramid. And it was not just in Giza. Temples across Egypt show similar patterns. Rooms with perfect acoustic properties. Chambers where a single voice can fill the air like a choir. Stones that vibrate when the wind passes through. Why would a civilization spend so much effort crafting sound into stone unless they knew it did something real? The Vatican has never commented on these theories, but they hold many early reports from European explorers who noted these strange effects. Documents that were filed and forgotten, or buried. Because if sound can heal, if vibration can awaken something inside us, then that knowledge is a threat to systems that profit from control. The ancients may not have had microphones or speakers, but they had something better, a living understanding of the universe as vibration, and they built it into the very stones we still walk among. Maybe they were not just builders, Maybe they were tuning the human soul, one tone at a time. Step inside an ancient Egyptian temple, and you are not just walking through stone, you are walking through a body, not a dead one, a living one, a blueprint. Because the deeper you go, the more it feels like something is watching you, not from above, from within. For centuries, scholars saw temple layouts as symbolic. But when researchers started comparing them to diagrams of the human nervous system, something strange appeared. The parts matched. The sanctuaries aligned with brain structures. The corridors followed the spine. Chambers were placed like organs. These temples were not just places of worship, they were maps. Maps of the body. Maps of the mind. The Temple of Luxor is one of the clearest examples. Its layout mirrors the human skeleton and central nervous system with astonishing precision. The further you walk into the temple, the more it feels like you are moving through a living anatomy lesson. But this was not random. The Egyptians knew exactly what they were doing. They believed the body was not just flesh and bone. It was a vehicle, a container for energy, for spirit. And if you wanted to awaken that energy, you had to understand the structure. The spine was sacred. The brain was the throne of transformation. The heart was more than emotion. It was memory, truth, connection. Some of the carvings on the walls do not just show rituals, they show energy points, flow lines, what modern science might call neural pathways or chakras. The Eye of Horus itself has been compared to a cross-section of the human brain. Not just similar, almost identical. How did they know? How did they understand something we are only now beginning to explore? There is a reason temple initiates had to go through stages of learning. Each room represented a part of the body, a part of the self. And to move forward, you had to master that level, not memorize, transform. It was not just about prayer. It was about becoming awake. So why is this knowledge missing from history books? Why is it laughed off as coincidence? Because if these temples were built to mirror human consciousness, then it means the Egyptians were not primitive at all. They were advanced, in ways that threaten the story we have been told. The Vatican has long denied any connection between Egyptian spiritual science and Christian mysticism. But the parallels are hard to ignore. Saints glowing with halos, sacred hearts on fire, ascension through light. These are not just symbols, they are echoes, pieces of an older truth that was buried, then renamed. If the temples were maps, and we are the destination, then every step through their halls is a step back into memory. A memory the world forgot, or was forced to forget. Maybe the Egyptians were not building monuments to gods. Maybe they were building mirrors, reflecting what we truly are. And if we read the blueprint right, we might finally remember how to wake up. There is something about the Eye of Horus that feels more than just ancient. It shows up everywhere in Egyptian art, carved into stone worn as jewelry painted on the walls of tombs and temples, always watching, always present. It was a symbol of protection, healing, wisdom, and power. But what if it was also something else? A clue, a code, a message that science is only now beginning to understand. The Eye of Horus is not just a pretty design. When you look closely at its curves, lines, and shapes, they match something very specific. The cross-section of the human brain. Not kind of, not almost, exact. The eyebrow matches the corpus callosum. The spiral under the eye aligns with the thalamus. The tearline leads into the pineal gland. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The pineal gland is sometimes called the third eye. It sits deep in the center of the brain and is connected to our sleep cycles, intuition, and what some believe is spiritual vision. The Egyptians knew about this gland. They called it the seat of the soul. They drew it in plain sight, hidden inside a symbol people thought was just decorative. But it was not just art, it was anatomy. This brings up a question nobody wants to answer. How did they know? They had no X-rays, no scalpels, no microscopes. And yet, they drew the human brain with more accuracy than any civilization that came after them for thousands of years. That kind of knowledge does not come from guessing. It comes from understanding. Deep understanding. Some believe the Eye of Horus was more than just a symbol of seeing. It was about seeing inward, seeing truth, not with your eyes but with your consciousness, and that the rituals performed under its protection were not just prayers, they were practices designed to activate the mind, to unlock parts of the brain most people never access. In modern hospitals, the brain scan that shows activity and energy lights up in patterns that look eerily like the eye, not just in shape, but in function. The areas responsible for intuition, balance, perception, all sit right where the eye points. Coincidence or confirmation? There are whispers that early church scholars saw these connections too, and that some texts discussing the pineal gland and its power were removed from public view, replaced with metaphors, or worse, banned completely. Because a symbol that teaches people how to awaken their own divinity is a threat to any system built on dependence and obedience. The Eye of Horus was never about fear. It was about remembering that we are more than flesh, more than thought, that inside us is a technology more powerful than any machine, a gateway to something eternal. The eye sees not because it watches others, but because it reminds us to look within. And once you do that, the real vision begins. The kind that never closes. The kind that never forgets. Most people think the Egyptians were obsessed with death. Mummies, pyramids, tombs, filled with gold and strange spells. But what if it was never about death? What if the entire system of afterlife rituals was really about something else? Not superstition, not fear, but transformation. The ancient texts talk about a journey after death, a path through darkness, trials, gates, and judgment. But hidden in those stories is a pattern, a blueprint for awakening. The soul moves through tests, not just to be judged, but to be changed, purified, remembered. This was not just about reaching the afterlife. It was about becoming something more along the way. The Book of the Dead is not really a book about dying. Its real name is the Book of Coming Forth by Light. That does not sound like an ending. It sounds like a beginning. Like the soul is not leaving the world, but returning to something brighter. And every ritual, every symbol, every step was designed to help that happen. The weighing of the heart against the feather was not about punishment, it was about truth. The heart had to be light because it carried memory. If you held on to lies, guilt, fear, it would weigh you down, and you could not rise to the next level. It was not about God's deciding your fate, it was about you freeing yourself. Even the process of mummification followed this same idea. It was not just preserving the body, it was creating a temple, a sacred container through which the soul could continue its journey. And the way the body was wrapped, the objects placed around it, the symbols painted on the walls, all pointed toward a deeper goal, not survival, ascension. The Egyptians believed that death was not an end, it was a doorway, and that if you passed through it consciously with the right knowledge and preparation, you would not just live again, you would awaken. You would become a being of light, a spirit who remembered everything. Some scholars now believe that the rituals performed in the temples were not just for the dead, they were for the living. High initiates would enter dark chambers, fasted for days, surrounded by symbols and sound. And when they emerged, they claimed to have seen the afterlife, not through stories, through experience. They died before dying, and in doing so they lost their fear, and gained something the world had forgotten. The Vatican has kept quiet on the parallels between Egyptian resurrection and Christian salvation. But the stories are almost the same. A guide through darkness, a death and rebirth, a light at the end. The difference is in the control. One system teaches you to wait for a saviour, the other teaches you how to become one. The secret of immortality was never hidden in gold or locked in sarcophagi. It was written in the stars, in the symbols, in the chambers of silence. And it was meant for anyone willing to walk the path, not to escape death, but to remember that you were never just a body in the first place. It sits in silence, half buried in sand, watching the stars with eyes that have seen more than we can imagine. The Great Sphinx of Giza is one of the oldest and most mysterious monuments on Earth. Carved from a single block of limestone, its face is worn smooth by time, but the real secret is not what is above the surface, it is what lies beneath. For years, whispers have surrounded the base of the Sphinx, not just legends, but real science. In the 1990s, ground-penetrating radar scans revealed cavities beneath the pores of the Sphinx, symmetrical, hollow, hidden. One chamber in particular set off alarms. It appeared to be a sealed vault, a room untouched for thousands of years. So why has no one opened it? Egyptian authorities first denied the scans, then quietly admitted they were real. But they have never allowed full excavation. No one knows what is inside, or if someone already does. Some believe this chamber is the legendary Hall of Records, a vault said to contain scrolls from a forgotten age, records of a time before the flood, before pharaohs, when a different kind of civilization walked the earth. A civilization with knowledge of the stars, energy, and the human soul. A civilization erased from history. The Sphinx itself may hold clues. It faces exactly east toward the rising sun on the spring equinox. That is not a coincidence. Its body is lion-shaped, and some researchers believe it once had the head of a lion too, before it was recarved into a human form. If true, the original statue would date back to at least 10,000 years ago. That is twice as old as mainstream history allows. So who built it? And what were they trying to protect? The idea of a hidden chamber filled with ancient knowledge sounds like something from a movie. But the evidence keeps growing. The erosion patterns on the Sphinx suggest heavy rainfall, which has not occurred in that region since the end of the last ice age. That means the Sphinx was already ancient when Egypt was born. If that chamber is opened and found to contain texts, artifacts, or even technology from a lost era, it would change everything. Our timeline, our origins, our understanding of civilization itself. Some say that efforts to uncover the truth have been blocked not just by local officials, but by international interests, including religious institutions that would rather keep the past buried. If a pre-Egyptian culture once mastered science and spirituality in ways we cannot explain, then the story we have been told about progress and divine revelation begins to fall apart. The Vatican holds many artifacts taken from early digs in Egypt, some never shown to the public. Could they already know what lies beneath the Sphinx? Could they be protecting a secret not out of fear, but out of control? Whatever the truth is, the Sphinx is not just a statue. It is a sentinel, a guardian of something older than history. And one day, when the sand finally gives way, it may speak again. With a voice the world forgot how to hear, walk through the heart of Rome, and you will see something strange. Towering stones carved with symbols not from Latin, but from the deserts of Egypt. Obelisks. Ancient monuments that once stood in front of temples beneath the burning sun. Now they pierce the skies of Europe, surrounded by churches, cathedrals, and the power of empire. But why are they there? What did Rome see in Egypt that made them bring these massive stones across oceans and continents? This was not about decoration. It was about domination. The Roman emperors knew that Egypt held a kind of power they could not fully understand, but deeply wanted. Not just military power, not just gold, but spiritual authority. Egypt was old, mysterious, respected, even feared. To control Egypt was to control the source of ancient wisdom, and to bring its symbols to Rome was like claiming that wisdom as their own. Obelisks were not just giant pillars, they were antennas, markers, each one carved from a single piece of stone aligned to the sun and stars. The Egyptians believed they connected heaven and earth, that the energy of the divine flowed through them like a beam of light. They stood at the entrances of temples because they were keys, portals. When a Roman emperor took an obelisk from Egypt and placed it in the center of his city, he was not just stealing stone, he was trying to steal the light. Many of these obelisks ended up in very specific places: St. Peter's Square, the Lateran Palace, in front of basilicas and near papal buildings. These were not random choices. They were rituals in stone. The church knew the weight of these symbols. They were not afraid of pagan idols. They were absorbing them, rewriting their meaning while keeping the power. Some believe the Vatican even performed reconsecration ceremonies, ancient rituals wrapped in new language, cleansing the obelisks of their Egyptian roots while secretly tapping into their original force. It was not about destroying Egypt's past. It was about controlling its memory. There are stories that beneath certain obelisks in Rome are buried time capsules, scrolls, relics, things taken from temples that no one talks about. If true, then these stones are more than historical trophies. They are locks, and someone still holds the keys. The obsession did not stop in Rome. Paris, London, even Washington, D.C. now have Egyptian obelisks standing in their public squares, symbols of empire, of control, of inherited power. But the question remains, what exactly were they inheriting? If the obelisks were indeed designed to channel energy or mark sacred geometry, then moving them across the planet changes that grid. It reshapes how energy flows through the land. Maybe that was the plan all along, to take the heart of Egypt and pulse it through the veins of a new world order. Rome never truly let go of Egypt, it just put on a different face. But the stones remember, and they are still standing, still watching, still humming with a silence that speaks louder than any sermon. They say it was an accident, a fire caused by war, by carelessness, by the chaos of conquest. But the more you look into the story, the more it feels like something else, something darker. The burning of the Library of Alexandria was not just a tragedy, it was a crime. And maybe even a cover-up. At its peak, the Library of Alexandria held over 400,000 scrolls. Some say it was closer to 1 million. Texts from every corner of the ancient world. Egypt, Greece, Persia, India, even lost civilizations no one speaks of today. It was not just a library, It was a memory, a living record of who we were and what we once knew. There were scrolls on medicine, astronomy, sound, energy, and the structure of the soul. Writings that hinted at technologies we no longer have. Maps of the stars drawn with impossible precision. Diagrams of the human body that rival modern science. And philosophies that made the mind feel infinite. So why would anyone want to destroy that? Because knowledge is power, and uncontrolled knowledge is dangerous. To the wrong people, it is chaos, a world that cannot be ruled. So if someone wanted to rewrite history to make themselves the source of truth, then the first step would be simple. Erase everything that came before. Over the centuries, many different groups were blamed for the fire. Julius Caesar, early Christian zealots, Muslim armies. But the truth is, no one really knows when it happened, or how many times. Some believe the library was not destroyed in one great blaze, but slowly over time. 1,000 quiet cuts, scrolls taken, hidden sold, burned one by one, until nothing remained. What if that was the plan? Some scrolls were said to have been smuggled out before the flames, taken to hidden vaults in Rome, in Constantinople, in underground monasteries. The Vatican owns thousands of ancient manuscripts that have never been made public. Could they be the last pieces of Alexandria? Could they hold the knowledge we were never meant to see? There are whispers of texts that spoke of humanity's true origins, that described cycles of time older than the stars, that named the forces who came before the gods, not myths, memories. And that kind of knowledge would shake the foundation of every empire that rose after. Alexandria was more than a city. It was a symbol of openness, of curiosity, of minds that refused to kneel. Burning it was not just about flames, it was about fear. A fear that people might learn to think for themselves, to heal themselves, to guide their own souls. Was it an accident? Or was it an erasure, a silencing, a reset of human memory? The ashes are long gone, but the questions still burn. And if even one scroll survived, then maybe the library is not gone. Maybe it is just sleeping, waiting for someone brave enough to open the past and read what was never meant to be forgotten. Before Rome declared itself the center of Christian truth, something else was happening in Egypt. In the deserts around the Nile, in hidden caves and quiet monasteries, a different kind of Christianity was taking shape. The Copts, early Egyptian Christians who followed teachings that were raw, mystical, and free from the rules the empire would soon force upon the world. The word Coptic just means Egyptian. These were not outsiders. They were the direct spiritual descendants of ancient temple builders, healers, and astronomers. When Christianity reached Egypt, it did not erase the old ways, it blended with them. The result was something powerful, something Rome could not control. Coptic texts, like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, and the Book of Enoch, told a different story than the official Bible. They spoke of inner light, direct connection with the divine and personal transformation, without the need for priests or buildings. In these writings, Jesus was not just a saviour. He was a teacher showing the path that every soul could walk. That kind of message was dangerous. The church in Rome needed hierarchy. It needed obedience, and it needed to be the only voice that spoke for God. The Copts did not follow those rules. They believed the kingdom of heaven was already inside you. That sacred knowledge could be found within, and that truth was something to be remembered, not handed down from a throne. For a while, both paths existed side by side, but as Rome grew stronger, the pressure to conform increased. Councils were held, books were banned, names were erased, Coptic Christians became targets. Their monasteries were attacked, their scrolls were burned, their language was nearly lost. But not completely. In 1945, a discovery changed everything. Near the town of Nag Hammadi, a farmer found a sealed jar buried in the ground. Inside were leather-bound books filled with Coptic texts, long thought destroyed. They contained teachings that had been hidden for over 1,000 years. Pages that spoke of divine light, sacred memory, and the power of knowing yourself, not through fear, but through awakening. Some scholars believe these texts were buried on purpose to keep them safe during a purge. If that is true, then someone in the early church feared what the Copts knew, feared it enough to bury it in the ground and hope it would never be found. The Vatican has copies of these texts now, but they rarely speak of them. They are not taught in churches, not quoted from the pulpit. Because if people knew that the earliest Christians followed a very different path, they might start asking questions. The Coptic key is not just about lost books. It is about the door those books can still unlock. A door into a version of Christianity that empowers instead of controls, that remembers instead of obeys, and that sees the divine not above us, but already within. That is the secret the empire tried to erase, but the desert never forgets, and neither do the stones. In the dry hills of Upper Egypt, a farmer went searching for fertilizer. What he found instead would shake the foundations of Christian history. It was 1945, near a place called Nag Hammadi. Hidden in a buried clay jar were 13 ancient books bound in leather. They were written in Coptic and had been untouched for over 1,000 years. Inside were Gospels no one had seen since the earliest days of Christianity, and they told a very different story. These texts were not like the ones in the Bible. There were no stories of miracles, no sermons to crowds, no commands to build churches. Instead, they spoke of light, of remembering, of turning inward to discover something eternal. They described Jesus not as a distant saviour, but as a mystic, a guide, someone who taught that the kingdom of heaven was already inside each person, and that salvation came from awakening, not from obedience. The Gospel of Thomas was one of the most shocking. It is just a list of sayings. No miracles, no crucifixion, just words. And some of those words challenge everything the official church would later teach. Jesus says things like, "If you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you." That does not sound like the voice of control. It sounds like freedom. There was also the Gospel of Mary, a book that shows Mary Magdalene not as a side character, but as someone who understood the message more deeply than the male disciples. In this text, she speaks of inner vision and overcoming fear. She is not a sinner. She is a leader, which might explain why this gospel was buried. The people who hid these texts were probably Coptic monks. They knew that something was changing, that a new version of Christianity was taking over, one with rules, hierarchies, and power structures. The old way, the mystical way, was being erased, so they sealed the books in a jar and buried them in the earth, hoping that one day someone would find them. When scholars began to translate the Nag Hammadi texts, many in the church stayed silent. Others tried to discredit them, but the writings were real, ancient, and deeply spiritual. They did not attack Jesus. They honored him, but they showed a version of him that was dangerous to systems built on control. A teacher who said, "Look within," not look up. A guide who said, "Remember who you are," not follow, blindly. The Vatican has never officially accepted these Gospels as part of its teachings. They sit in libraries and private collections studied by a few but unknown to most. Yet their message is simple and powerful. You are not broken. You do not need permission to find truth. And the divine is not locked behind stone walls or ancient titles. The gospel of the desert was buried for safety. But now that it has been uncovered, its light is spreading again, quietly, patiently, like seeds waiting for rain. And maybe, just maybe, it was never lost at all, just waiting to be remembered. In the shadows between empires, a new God was born, not in heaven, not in myth, but in a palace. Serapis was his name, a strange fusion of Egyptian power and Greek philosophy wrapped in Roman ambition. He did not rise from legend. He was designed, created to bring people together under a single religion, not to inspire faith, but to control it. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt, he did not destroy its beliefs. He studied them, admired them. But when his successors took over, they saw a problem. The Greeks worshipped one way, the Egyptians another. If the new rulers wanted peace, they needed unity. So they did what empires always do. They invented a symbol. Serapis was made to look like a Greek god, but speak with Egyptian wisdom. He wore a flowing beard like Zeus and held the symbols of Osiris. He sat on a throne that hinted at cosmic order. Above his head, a basket called a modius, a symbol of grain and wealth, but also something else: storage, containment, a silent reminder that power could be harvested and kept. Temples to Serapis were built all over, in Alexandria, in Rome, even as far as London. Priests called him a healer, a saviour, a bridge between worlds. But behind the marble walls, the message was clear. Believe in Serapis, and you believe in the empire. You accept the merger of gods because it means peace, order, and, most importantly, obedience. But not everyone agreed. Many Egyptians saw Serapis as a lie, a mask meant to erase their older gods, their deeper truths. And when Christianity began to rise, Serapis did not fade quietly. In fact, many early images of Jesus look suspiciously like Serapis: the long hair, the robes, the peaceful pose. It was not just art style, it was inheritance, a recycling of symbols to help people transition from one belief to the next. The early church was not blind to this. In fact, they leaned into it. They understood that people trust what feels familiar. So they took the image of Serapis, softened it, gave it new stories, and called it holy. This was not about deception, it was about design. The goal was not to spread truth, it was to build a religion that could survive and rule. The Vatican inherited this strategy. As Christianity grew, it absorbed festivals, temples, even gods, rebranded them, redirected them. Serapis may have vanished from worship, but his template lived on. A divine figure who combined opposites, who stood for harmony but demanded control. Today, few remember Serapis. His statues gather dust, his temples lie in ruins, but the idea behind him never died. Create a symbol that everyone can follow, blend just enough truth with just enough comfort, and you can lead people anywhere. The hybrid God was not just a product of the past, he is a blueprint, and if we do not look closely, we may follow his reflection without ever knowing his name. Long before churches filled with pews and stained glass, there were temples carved from stone, lit by oil lamps, echoing with chants that stretched back through the ages. In Egypt, the temple priests were not just religious leaders. They were scientists, healers, astronomers, and keepers of memory. They had guarded the sacred stories for thousands of years. Then one day, a new voice arrived. A new story, a new God. And with it came a battle not fought with swords, but with silence. The early Christians did not just preach a message. They brought a revolution. Their God did not live in a statue or rise with the sun. He was invisible, unknowable, and absolute. To the Egyptian priests, this was not just foreign, it was dangerous. Because it was not just about belief, it was about power. Whoever controlled the narrative of God controlled the soul of civilization. At first, the temples tried to adapt. They welcomed the new teachers. They offered parallels. They pointed to the ancient myths of resurrection, the stories of Osiris reborn, the sacred trinity of Isis, Horus, and the Father. They said, "We already know this story. We have lived it for generations." But the early church was not interested in sharing. It wanted to replace, to erase. The priests who once held the wisdom of the stars were suddenly called pagans, their texts labelled heresy, their rituals mocked as superstition. The temples that once trained philosophers and physicians were stripped of meaning and left to rot. It was not just theology. It was a takeover. Christian bishops, backed by imperial power, began converting temples into churches. Holy sites were rededicated. Old statues smashed, scrolls burned. The priests were forced to abandon their teachings or hide them underground. Some vanished into the desert, joining secret brotherhoods. Others were killed. There were moments of resistance. Some scholars tried to preserve what they could. They carved symbols into stone that could not be easily erased. They encoded messages in artwork. They whispered the old songs at night, hoping that memory would survive the purge, because they knew something most people did not. That this was not about saving souls, it was about rewriting the story. The battle reached a climax in Alexandria, the great library gone, the Serapeum destroyed, and with it a final blow to the priesthood that had guided Egypt for millennia. The last high priests faded into history, their voices silenced, their wisdom buried. But some believe the war never truly ended, that even today the battle over belief continues, between those who say truth is handed down and those who say it is remembered. Between a God who demands worship and a universe that invites understanding, the priesthood war was not about which God was real, it was about who gets to tell the story. And in that story, we are all characters, which means we still have a choice to listen, to question, to remember, and maybe to finish what the priests began, before the silence took over. There was a time when knowledge was written on papyrus, not paper. Ink made from plants flowing across smooth sheets, rolled into scrolls and tucked into temple walls. Egypt had thousands of them, some older than any book in Europe. They told stories of the stars, of the soul, of the laws of the universe. But when the church rose to power, many of those scrolls vanished, not lost by accident, buried on purpose, or rewritten. As Christianity grew, it needed structure, it needed rules, it needed one version of truth. But Egypt had too many. Too many gods, too many symbols, too many ways of understanding the divine. So the scribes came, some with good intentions, others with orders. They were told to copy what fit, to change what was too strange, and to leave out what might raise too many questions. They took papyrus scrolls and translated them into Latin and Greek, but words got changed, meanings twisted. A hymn to the Divine Mother became a warning against false idols. A story about light and transformation became a tale of sin and judgment. Over time, the original messages were buried beneath layers of fear. In some cases, whole texts were locked away, kept in underground vaults or secret Vatican libraries. Even today, there are Egyptian manuscripts in Rome that have never been shown to the public. Some scholars say they contain knowledge of energy healing, the power of sound, the cycles of time, and the origins of the soul. Things that do not fit the official story. The pyramids were never just tombs. They were symbols of ascent. The soul rising from the base of material life to the peak of spiritual light. The Egyptians mapped that journey in their writings. But to the early church, such ideas were dangerous. They taught that you did not need priests to find God, that heaven was a state of mind, not a place in the sky. So those teachings were edited or erased. The Vatican became the new guardian of old knowledge. But instead of sharing it, they filtered it. They turned myths into metaphors, gods into demons, ancient wisdom into forbidden law, and slowly the memory of Egypt as a source of sacred science began to fade. But not completely. Fragments still surface, in monasteries in the desert, in ruins left untouched, in stories passed down by families who never forgot, and sometimes in the margins of old church manuscripts where a scribe would secretly preserve a line too beautiful to destroy. Why go to all this effort? Why erase the past so carefully? Because stories shape power, and whoever controls the past can control the future. Papyrus and pyramids may seem like relics, but they hold keys to a time when the divine was not a mystery to fear, but a force to explore. And though the ink has faded and the scrolls have crumbled, the truth waits, quiet, patient, written in the stones and in the silence between the lines. Walk into a cathedral and look closely, not just at the stained glass, or the gold, or the statues. Look at the shapes, the symbols, the tiny details carved into corners or woven into robes. You might think they are just decoration, but many of them are much older than the church itself, older than Rome, older even than the Bible. They come from the sands of Egypt, and they are everywhere. The cross is the most obvious one. But before it became the symbol of Christianity, it looked very similar to the Egyptian ankh, a cross with a loop at the top. It meant life, eternal life, not through death, but through awakening, through balance, through understanding the connection between the physical and the divine. Early Christians knew this. Some even wore the ankh before the crucifix became popular. It was only later that the symbols were separated. Now, look at the Pope's staff. It is called a crozier, curved at the top like a shepherd's crook. But compare it to the staffs carried by Egyptian gods like Osiris. They too held curved staffs, symbols of guidance and authority. The Church says the crozier shows spiritual leadership, but its shape and meaning were borrowed from a much older tradition. Even the papal hat has a story. Its tall cone shape is not Roman. It mirrors the white crown of Upper Egypt worn by the pharaohs, a crown meant to show the ruler's connection to heaven, to divine wisdom. When the Church adopted similar headwear, it sent a silent message that the power of Egypt had not been destroyed, just absorbed. In the grand cathedrals of Europe, you will also find carvings of suns, moons, serpents, and wings, all of them powerful in Egyptian symbolism. The sun represented the source of all life. The serpent was knowledge. The wings meant ascension. You will see these same images behind altars above doorways, even painted on ceilings, not by mistake, but by memory. Look at the halo around the heads of saints. Circles of light, a sign of holiness. But in Egypt, those halos were already being painted thousands of years earlier, around the heads of gods and pharaohs, to show they were illuminated, connected to something beyond the physical. When Christianity spread, those same golden circles followed. Why would the church use these symbols? Some say it was to help pagans convert, to make the new faith feel familiar. But maybe there was another reason. Maybe they knew that symbols carry energy, that shapes and images can speak to the subconscious, and that by using the sacred designs of Egypt, they were tapping into a force older than doctrine. These are not coincidences, they are choices. Echoes of a past the church claimed to forget, but the truth never stays buried. It hides in plain sight, in stained glass, in robes, in ancient stone, waiting for someone to finally notice that the symbols never left. They just moved into the shadows and kept watching. Long before statues of Mary stood in cathedrals across Europe, another mother watched over the people. Her name was Isis. She was worshipped across Egypt and even into the Roman Empire. She was called the Mother of Heaven, the Queen of the Sea, the Lady of Magic. She held her child Horus in her arms, just like Mary would later hold Jesus. But the similarities run deeper than just statues. They tell a story of transformation, of a goddess turned into a saint, and of how the church used one mother to erase another. Isis was one of the most loved and powerful figures in ancient Egypt. She was not just a mother, she was a healer, a protector, and a symbol of rebirth. Her story was one of love and loss, and bringing life back from the dead. When her husband Osiris was killed, she searched the earth to gather his body. When she found it, she used her magic to bring him back to life, long enough to conceive their son. That son, Horus, became the symbol of divine kingship, and Isis became the image of perfect motherhood. As the Roman Empire expanded, it did not destroy Isis, it adopted her. Temples to Isis were built all over Europe. Her worship grew, and her image changed slightly to match local styles. But she was still the same powerful mother. When Christianity began to rise, it saw a problem. People were not ready to let go of Isis. So the church offered something new, a new mother, with a new name, Mary. The earliest images of Mary and Jesus look almost exactly like Isis and Horus. The pose, the clothing, the expressions. It was not just coincidence, it was familiarity. The church knew that people needed symbols they could connect with, so they gave them Mary, pure, gentle, and silent, but also strong, sacred, and untouchable. They took the magic out, removed the spells, but kept the love, the protection, the power. Over time, Mary became central to Catholic worship, prayers, songs, statues. But the roots of her image still go back to Isis. Even the titles are similar. Queen of Heaven, Mother of God, Star of the Sea. These were all once names of Isis. Now they belong to Mary. In the Vatican, there are paintings and sculptures that still show hints of this transformation. Some statues even look more like Isis than Mary. Long robes, throned posture, stars on the head, crescent moons at the feet. These are not Christian symbols. They are echoes of a much older story. Why does this matter? Because it shows how religions evolve. How old gods are not destroyed, just renamed, repackaged, made safe, but the power is still there. And when you pray to the Mother of God, you might still be whispering, to the Lady of Magic. Isis did not disappear. She was absorbed, sanitized, but never forgotten. And in the silence of candlelit chapels, she might still be listening, wrapped in new clothes, still holding the child, still watching the world sleep. There is a reason secret societies survive. It is not just because they hide in shadows, it is because they remember things the world was told to forget. And among the oldest and most mysterious of these groups is the Freemasons. To most, they are just an old fraternity with strange symbols and long ceremonies. But beneath that image is something deeper, a memory, a link to Egypt, a quiet rebellion against the Vatican's control over knowledge. Freemasonry did not start in the Middle Ages. That is just when it got its name. Its roots stretch back much further to the builders of temples and pyramids, the architects who carved sacred geometry into stone, the ones who understood that shape and number were not just for buildings, they were for the soul. The Masons saw the universe as a kind of blueprint, a design filled with meaning. Circles, squares, triangles, each with power, each a symbol of something spiritual. And they believed that by studying this hidden language, you could understand creation itself. That belief came straight from Egypt. Egyptian priests used geometry to align temples with stars. They believed in the sacred measure, that numbers were alive, that architecture could connect heaven and earth. These ideas did not die when the temples fell. They just moved underground, preserved by those who knew the Vatican would never allow such teachings in the open. As the church grew stronger, it began to hunt down anything that did not fit its doctrine. Books were burned, temples destroyed, but the Masons kept building, quietly, symbolically. They met in private, passed down knowledge through coded rituals, and taught that truth was something you earned, not something you were given. Look at a Masonic lodge, and you will find Egyptian imagery everywhere. The Eye of Horus, the twin pillars of the temple, the obelisk, even the checkerboard floors. All of it drawn from the past, all of it still speaking, even if most do not hear it anymore. The Vatican knew about the Masons and feared them, not because they were violent, but because they remembered, and remembering is a kind of rebellion. The church accused them of heresy, of worshipping strange gods, of being enemies of the faith, but the Masons kept their silence. They never fought back with swords, just symbols. Some say the Freemasons helped preserve scrolls from Egypt, that their highest members still study ancient texts locked away from the public, that deep within their ranks are those who carry fragments of a much older wisdom, a wisdom that sees God not as a ruler in the sky, but as a pattern in all things. The Masons do not preach, they do not convert, they teach through stories, through signs, through the quiet belief that the divine is something you build inside yourself. The Vatican tried to erase the past. The Masons built around it. And somewhere between the cathedral and the pyramid, the old truth still stands, waiting, in stone, in silence, remembered. The history books talk a lot about Napoleon's scientists in Egypt, or British explorers digging up tombs for museums. But there is another set of expeditions that almost never gets mentioned, quieter, funded in secret, led not by treasure hunters or historians, but by men in black robes, Jesuits. The Vatican's elite order, sent into the sands of Egypt between the 1500s and 1800s, not to collect gold, but to uncover something even more dangerous, knowledge. The Jesuits were not ordinary priests. They were soldiers of the mind, trained in languages, science, politics, and most importantly, secrecy. Founded in the 16th century, the Society of Jesus answered only to the Pope. Their mission was to defend and expand the Church's influence, but part of that meant understanding the threats, especially the ancient ones. From the moment Egypt opened its ruins to Europe, the Vatican watched closely. While public expeditions made headlines, private ones went unrecorded. Jesuit scholars dressed as archaeologists travelled with forged names. They mapped sites, copied inscriptions, and sent detailed reports back to Rome, reports that were never published, never shared, just locked in archives. Why would the Church care so much about old temples and broken statues? Because the further you dig in Egypt, the older the knowledge gets, and some of it does not match the official timeline. Temples aligned with forgotten stars. Texts that describe the soul not as something judged, but something evolved. Symbols that suggest energy healing, sound frequencies, and star maps far beyond what should have been known. The Jesuits were looking for more than history. They were looking for patterns, for connections between ancient Egypt and early Christianity, for proof that the teachings of Jesus were not new but remembered. That ideas about resurrection, the Trinity, the inner light, had already existed long before Bethlehem. And if that were true, the Church would lose its claim to divine origin. Some of the Jesuit expeditions went deep into the desert, into places rarely visited even today. There are rumours of sealed chambers opened only once, of scrolls photographed then hidden, of artifacts taken not to preserve, but to erase. Items that, if shown to the world, would raise too many questions. A few fragments have leaked out: personal journals, letters home, mentions in obscure Vatican catalogues. One report from 1743 describes a ruined temple covered in strange hieroglyphs, not matching any known style. Another speaks of a black stone that vibrated when touched. These are not things you read about in museum labels. They are pieces of a puzzle someone does not want finished. The Jesuits never held press conferences. They did not publish their findings, but they kept coming back for centuries. Always with new tools, new questions, and the same quiet urgency. They were not there to learn, they were there to confirm. To gather evidence of a story the Church had already chosen to suppress. Whatever they found is likely buried beneath the Vatican now, not in the basement, but in the archives, sealed behind codes and oaths. Because if it ever came out, people might realize that the oldest truths are not lost, they are hidden. And the ones who hid them wore crosses over their hearts and sand in their shoes. There are letters no one was meant to read, sealed with wax, stamped with Vatican rings, and carried across deserts by trusted hands. Letters between Jesuit scholars in Egypt and their superiors in Rome. They were never printed in journals, never stored in public archives, because what they described was not just about tombs or treasures. It was about secrets. Old ones. Dangerous ones. The kind that could shatter the story the Church had spent centuries protecting. The Valley of the Kings is famous for golden masks and royal coffins. But the Jesuits were not looking for wealth. They were looking for patterns. Hidden inscriptions. Strange carvings on walls, deep underground. Things that did not belong. Things that pointed to a knowledge far older than the pharaohs. And when they found them, they wrote letters. Detailed, nervous, marked urgent and confidential. One letter, dated 1697, describes a chamber beneath a tomb that had no name. The scholar says the walls were covered in symbols that looked more like diagrams than decoration. Spirals, intersecting lines, human figures with stars inside their heads. It read more like a manual than a myth. The scholar begged for instructions, should they bring it back. photograph it, destroy it. Another letter from 1774 warns of a tablet made from polished stone that seemed to respond to sound. When certain words were spoken in the chamber, the tablet would hum. The Jesuit wrote that it felt alive, and that it made him question everything he had been taught about matter and spirit. The Vatican's reply came weeks later. Brief, do not publish. Return home immediately. Over time, the tone of the letters changed. Less wonder, more fear. One priest wrote about dreams that came after visiting a tomb. Dreams filled with fire and floating cities and voices speaking in languages he did not know but somehow understood. He called it a test. He asked if the devil could speak through ruins. The reply was blunt. Burn your notes. Remain silent. The seal of silence was not just a symbol, it was a command. The Jesuits had taken vows, obedience above all, so they obeyed. The discoveries were filed away, the letters locked in drawers beneath the Vatican, their names erased from the history books, but the fear remained that one day someone else would find the same chambers, someone without a vow to stay quiet. Today, only a few of these letters are known to exist. Snippets quoted by rogue historians, pages smuggled out by scholars who had seen too much, but they all tell the same story. That, in the heart of the Valley of the Kings, lies something older than kings. A code, a memory, a truth so deep it could not be buried with stone, only hidden with silence. And if the seal ever breaks, if even one of those letters reaches the world unfiltered, the questions will begin. Who were the Egyptians really? What did they know? And why did the men of God choose silence over truth? They stand like silent needles, piercing the sky, scattered across Rome, in plazas and courtyards, in front of churches and behind palaces, obelisks. Ancient stone spires, carved in Egypt thousands of years ago, then dragged across oceans and deserts to the heart of the Vatican's empire. Tourists snap photos. Locals walk by without a glance. But if you stop and look long enough, you might start to notice something strange. The obelisks are not random. They are placed with precision, as if they are pieces of a puzzle, a code waiting to be cracked. Each obelisk once stood in Egypt as a marker, not just for kings, but for the cosmos. They pointed to the stars, aligned with the sun. Their shadows told time, and their carvings told stories. They were not just monuments, they were instruments of light, of energy, of meaning. So why did the Vatican want them? And more importantly, why did they arrange them the way they did? There are 13 Egyptian obelisks in Rome, the largest collection in the world outside of Egypt. Most were brought during the Roman Empire, but their final placements came much later, especially under the careful eye of the Church. Some were moved, some restored, all placed with intention. Take St. Peter's Square. At the very centre stands an obelisk that once stood in Heliopolis, the Egyptian city of the sun. It is perfectly aligned so that at certain times of the year the shadow it casts falls directly along a specific path marked by stones in the ground. Some say it tracks the solstice. Others say it marks the cross-quarter days. The Vatican says it is just decoration, but it has been there since long before the basilica was built, and it was never moved. Other obelisks form a geometric pattern when plotted on a map, lines connecting major churches and basilicas in Rome. When the points are connected, some researchers claim they form sacred shapes, a key, a star. Even a cross inside a circle, echoes of ancient Egyptian geometry now hidden in plain sight under the cover of Catholic symbols. There are even obelisks that line up with constellations, not just at random but precisely, as if someone wanted to bring the heavens to earth, to recreate the sky using stone. This is the same idea found in Egyptian temples and pyramids. The Vatican just copied the blueprint, quietly, carefully. Why would they do this? Because symbols carry power, shapes influence energy, and those who understand the code can harness it. The obelisks are not just leftovers of empire, they are anchors, antennas, tools, still functioning, still aligned. The obelisk code is not taught in schools. You will not hear it in sermons, but it is there, etched into the streets of Rome, hidden behind history. The question is not why the Vatican placed them there. The question is what they are using them for, and what happens when the rest of the world starts to remember how to read stone. There are tombs in Egypt no one talks about, not because they are lost, but because they are off limits, not to tourists, not to thieves, but to everyone, sealed, guarded, and strangely connected to a place thousands of miles away, the Vatican. Most people think the Vatican only collects books, relics, paintings. But what if some of its most protected secrets are buried in the sands of Egypt, in tombs that were never opened? Not because they could not be, but because someone decided they should not be. In the 1000, 800s, and early 900s, while European explorers were opening every tomb they could find, there were a few that were quietly skipped. Sites that were marked on early maps but suddenly vanished from later ones. Tomb entrances that were documented by locals but never appeared in official reports. The reason given was usually danger or instability. But insiders whispered another explanation: orders from Rome. The theory is this: during secret Jesuit expeditions and early Vatican-backed digs, certain tombs were found that did not match the pattern. They were older, deeper, more complex, filled not with golden treasures, but with strange carvings and symbols that seemed out of place. Some even showed writing styles that did not match any known Egyptian script. When these discoveries were made, teams were pulled out, reports buried, entrances sealed. One such tomb is said to lie beneath the cliffs near Abydos. Local legends speak of a staircase carved into living rock that leads down for hours into total blackness. The walls lined with glowing patterns. At the lowest level is said to be a room that hums with sound when you step inside. No one has entered it in generations. But a few explorers claimed the Vatican sent men to study it. They never returned. Another rumoured tomb lies not far from the Valley of the Kings, hidden beneath a false wall in an already known temple. A chamber sealed behind a layer of stone so perfect you would never notice it unless you knew exactly where to look. The story goes that it contains a sarcophagus that does not hold a body, but a machine, a device that responds to light and tone. Some say it is not Egyptian at all. Some say it is not human. Why would the Vatican care? Because if the stories are true, these tombs hold evidence that changes everything about history, about technology, about the human soul, and most importantly, about who came before us. Evidence that cannot be explained with scripture. Evidence that might suggest ancient Egypt was not the beginning, but a memory of something even older. So they sealed them, locked them in darkness, surrounded by silence. And over time, most people forgot they were ever there. But not everyone forgot. The maps still exist. The rumours still pass from mouth to mouth. And the questions still grow. What did the Vatican find in those tombs? And what are they afraid we will see if they ever open them? The answer might not be gold. it might be something far more powerful, a truth too old to control, too big to hide forever. Most people think they have seen the Vatican museums just by walking the public halls. Marble floors, golden ceilings, rows of statues and endless paintings. But those rooms are only the surface. Behind guarded doors beyond the velvet ropes lies another museum, a hidden one, filled with things you were never meant to see. And at the heart of that hidden museum is a collection that almost no one talks about. Egyptian artifacts. Not the usual ones, not the scarabs and statues placed out in glass cases. The hidden ones, locked away, shelved in private vaults, covered in cloth or sealed in boxes marked restricted. These are not just old relics. They are pieces of a story that challenges the Church's own version of history. The Vatican has had an interest in Egypt for centuries. Jesuit scholars were among the first to study hieroglyphs. Popes collected papyrus scrolls and fragments of temple walls. Over time, the collection grew, but not everything made it to public display. Some items were kept in the back, sometimes for preservation, sometimes for secrecy. Among the most whispered about is a full-wall fragment from a destroyed temple near Thebes, covered in carvings of strange winged figures surrounding a glowing sphere. Some scholars say it shows a ritual involving sound and energy. Others say it looks like a map of the stars with planetary alignments that match no known date. It has never been shown to the public. Only a few researchers have ever seen it, and even fewer have spoken about it. There are also rumours of scrolls written in languages no one can identify. Some written in gold ink, others so fragile they are kept in vacuum-sealed cases. Translations are said to describe the body as a vessel of light, the mind as a portal. Ideas closer to quantum physics than medieval theology. These texts are not on display. They are filed deep in the archives, behind passwords, behind oaths. One former museum assistant once leaked that there is a sealed room beneath the main Egyptian wing, a climate-controlled vault that holds the strangest pieces, an obsidian disc carved with perfect circles, too precise for ancient tools, a mask that seems to glow faintly in the dark, a statue of a figure with eyes shaped like stars and hands held out as if offering something invisible. Why keep these hidden? The official answer is usually conservation, but unofficially, the reason is control. These artifacts do not just challenge timelines, they challenge beliefs. They hint at an Egypt that understood more than we give it credit for, about energy, about consciousness, about the fabric of reality. The Vatican has spent centuries collecting, but not always for worship, sometimes for silence. Because the best way to bury a secret is not to destroy it, it is to lock it in a museum and never open the door. Some say the hidden museum is larger than the one the public sees, that it holds not just Egypt, but other ancient memories, all waiting, all quiet, all guarded not by stone lions, but by the weight of forgotten truth. It started as a rumour, a whisper among scholars, a story about a single scroll discovered in the sands of Egypt that did not belong in the timeline we were told to believe. A papyrus so old and so dangerous, it did not just raise questions, it shattered them. And then just as quickly as it was found, it disappeared, gone, into the hands of the Vatican, locked away without a word. The scroll was discovered sometime in the late 19th century, near the ruins of an old temple outside Luxor. It was fragile, curled, and darkened by time, but the writing was clear. Not in Greek or Latin, but in an early Egyptian dialect that blended spiritual poetry with historical record. What made it different was not just what it said, but when it was written. If the dating is accurate, it came from a time centuries before the accepted birth of Jesus. Yet it told a story that sounded hauntingly familiar. It spoke of a teacher, born of light, not of flesh. A man who walked between worlds, who healed through vibration, who spoke of the soul as eternal and of the divine, not as a God above, but as a light within. His words were recorded by 12 followers. His path followed rivers and deserts. He was betrayed, he was killed, and then he returned, but not in body, in presence, in memory, in energy. The parallels were too close, too sharp. The scroll did not name him Jesus, but it told a version of the story we know today, just written hundreds of years too early. If true, it meant that the core ideas of Christianity were not new. They were inherited, remembered, or possibly rewritten. The scroll was shown briefly to a few local scholars before a representative from the Vatican arrived. Documents were signed, payments were made. The scroll was packed and taken away. It has not been seen since. Some say it was fake, that it was destroyed to prevent confusion. Others believe it sits now in the restricted archives deep beneath the Vatican Library, not destroyed, just buried. Because its existence raises too many questions. What if the scroll was not the only one? What if it was part of a larger set of writings that never survived? What if the stories we consider sacred are echoes of older tales, passed through time across cultures, and finally polished into the version we know today, a version controlled, simplified, made safe? The scroll that changed everything might still exist, its fibres sealed in darkness, its truth waiting to be read. But until then, we are left with fragments and shadows, pieces of a forgotten message carried through time like smoke. You can smell it, feel it, almost see it, but never hold it. Unless, of course, someone decides to break the silence, and when they do, the timeline might never look the same again. Before telescopes, before computers, before even the compass, there were the astronomers of Ra, priests of light, who watched the skies not just for beauty, but for knowledge. In ancient Egypt, astronomy was not a science. It was a sacred duty, a way to track time, yes, but also to understand the will of the gods. And what they discovered challenged everything, not just in their day, but in ours, especially when the church began rewriting the calendar and hiding the past. The priests of Ra did not guess at the stars. They built temples and monuments aligned perfectly with solstices and equinoxes. The pyramids themselves are star maps, frozen in stone. The Temple of Dendera contains carvings of the zodiac that still match modern celestial charts. They tracked Sirius, the brightest star in the sky, using it to predict the flooding of the Nile with stunning accuracy. Their knowledge was not primitive, it was precise. But the deeper truth is this. The Egyptians believed time was not a straight line. They saw it as a cycle. Life, death, rebirth. Not just for people, but for civilizations, for planets, for the universe itself. This view did not fit with the linear timeline the church wanted to create. One beginning, one end, one story. When Christianity rose to power, it began rewriting time. The old calendars were thrown out. The Julian, then the Gregorian calendar, were created to fit religious holidays and Roman politics. Days were shifted, months renamed. Even the start of the year was moved, all to control rhythm, to dictate memory. Egyptian star records posed a problem. They kept pointing to dates that did not match the new system. Temples aligned to stars no longer rose when they should. Entire centuries vanished from history when measured by the stars. Some scholars who studied Egyptian astronomy quietly suggested that the historical timeline might be off, not by years, but by hundreds of years. This was dangerous, because if time was being measured wrong, then history itself was wrong. And if history was wrong, then who wrote it, who changed it, and why? The Church could not allow that kind of doubt. So Egyptian stellar knowledge was pushed aside, called mythology, dismissed as superstition. The priests of Ra were turned into cartoon figures in textbooks, their math and observations ignored or hidden in academic footnotes. But not everyone forgot. Some astronomers kept looking, comparing sky charts across cultures, noticing the same alignments, the same patterns, the same warnings. Because the stars do not lie. They are clocks no one can reset, and the Egyptians knew how to read them. Their temples were observatories, their gods were constellations, their myths were encoded memories of sky events too massive to forget. If we read the sky the way they did, we might see the truth they left behind. That time is not fixed, that calendars can lie, and that, somewhere between the stars and the stone, someone tried very hard to make sure we forgot how to tell the difference. There are symbols that speak louder than words, shapes and signs that show up across time and cultures like echoes from a forgotten language. Two of the most powerful are the black sun and the phoenix. One looks like a star that gives no light. The other is a bird that burns itself to rise again. On the surface they seem different, but dig deep enough and you find they point to the same thing, a cycle, a secret, a truth so old, even the church tried to bury it. In ancient Egypt, the phoenix was not just a bird, it was called the Bennu, a creature linked to the sun god Ra. Said to rise from the ashes every 500 years, it became a symbol of cosmic renewal, the death of one age and the birth of another. Temples at Heliopolis were aligned to its flight. Priests told stories of how it would return when the world needed to be reborn, not as myth, as memory. Then there is the black sun, not as famous, not as easy to explain. It appears in esoteric texts as a hidden force, a dark twin of the sun, not evil, just unseen. Some said it ruled the space beneath the world. Others said it was the energy behind all transformation. Death without decay, light without heat. In Egyptian carvings, it shows up as a dark circle surrounded by serpents or wings. In early Christian texts, it is harder to spot, but it is there, hidden in coded language, the inner sun, the divine fire. Both symbols share a message. That real change comes through fire, that something must be broken before it can be reborn. That darkness is not the end, it is the beginning. When early Christian mystics studied Egyptian teachings, they noticed the same patterns. The story of Jesus mirrored the phoenix, death, burial, resurrection, light returning after darkness. And behind that story was the energy of the black sun, the hidden power that fuels transformation, not outside us, inside. But these were dangerous ideas. If the phoenix was not just a bird, and the black sun was not just a symbol, then religion was not about obedience. It was about awakening, about going through your own fire, about rising on your own terms. The church could not allow that, so the symbols were rewritten. The phoenix became decoration, a nice story, the black sun became taboo, linked to heresy and hidden away. Yet the symbols keep coming back, in stained glass windows, in secret orders, in the dreams of people who feel the world is ending and something new is about to begin. They whisper the same message. That endings are not failures. That the darkest moment holds the seed of light. The Egyptians knew this. So did the early Christians, before their words were edited. And maybe we know it too, somewhere deep, that no matter how lost things seem, the phoenix will rise. And the black sun will shine, just not in the sky, in us. Most people see the Great Pyramid as a tomb, a massive triangle of stone built to hold a dead king. But what if that idea is wrong? What if it was never meant to preserve the body at all? What if the Great Pyramid was a machine? A device built not for the dead, but for the soul. Not to bury someone, but to launch them somewhere else. And what if someone already figured that out, long ago, and made sure we would never understand what it really did? The Great Pyramid has always been strange. No writing on the walls, no treasures inside, no real proof that it ever held a pharaoh, just chambers, shafts, angles, so precise they still confuse engineers. For years people called it a wonder. But maybe that was just an excuse to stop asking questions. Inside the pyramid are passages that line up with stars, shafts that point directly to Orion and Sirius. Those are not random choices. Orion was linked to Osiris, the god of the afterlife. Sirius was tied to Isis, the goddess of rebirth. The ancients believed that when a person died, their soul travelled through these stars. It was not superstition, it was a map. Then there is the king's chamber. A granite box sits at the centre, not a coffin, not shaped like one, and no mummy was ever found in it. But when certain frequencies are played in that chamber, something strange happens. The walls vibrate, the air hums. It feels alive, as if the room was built to do something, to activate something. Some researchers believe the pyramid was designed to generate and channel energy, using the Earth's vibrations, using sound, using shape and resonance, not to power light bulbs, but to trigger a state of consciousness, a transformation, a resurrection, not of flesh, of awareness. This was a place where the soul could be set free, where the illusion of death could be broken, a resurrection machine. If that sounds wild, remember this. The Vatican has always had an interest in Egypt. Jesuit scholars studied the pyramids closely. Priests were sent to explore. Reports were written and quietly buried. What did they find that made them stop sharing? Some say early Christian texts hinted at something similar, that the resurrection of Christ was not about a body rising from the ground, but about the soul escaping the trap of death, becoming light. That the real secret of the church was not about waiting for salvation. It was about remembering how to reach it yourself. But if that is true, then everything changes. Faith becomes science. Prayer becomes vibration. The pyramid becomes proof. And that is why the story had to be rewritten. Why the machine had to become a tomb. Why the soul had to be forgotten. Because a machine that frees the soul is a threat to any system built on control. The Great Pyramid still stands, silent, timeless. Maybe it is waiting, not for explorers, but for someone who remembers how to turn it back on. The serpent has always been feared. In the Bible, it is the villain, the trickster in the Garden of Eden, the whisper in Eve's ear, the symbol of sin. But travel back to ancient Egypt and you find something very different. The serpent was not evil, it was sacred, a symbol of wisdom and healing, coiled not in shame but in glory. So how did one symbol become two stories? And what role did the Vatican play in that transformation? In Egyptian temples, the serpent was everywhere, worn on the crowns of pharaohs, painted on the walls of tombs, wrapped around staffs. It represented protection and enlightenment. The uraeus, the cobra, on the forehead of gods and kings, was seen as a guardian of higher knowledge. The serpent was a sign that someone had awakened, that they had unlocked the power of the mind. There were also serpents linked to medicine, like the image of a snake rising up a spine. Today we call it the staff of Hermes, or the caduceus. But in Egypt, it symbolized the life force moving through the body, a pathway to divine energy. It was not about poison, it was about power. Now compare that to the serpent in the Garden of Eden. There it becomes the enemy, the deceiver, the one who offers knowledge but is punished for it. That story flipped everything. Wisdom became temptation. Awakening became sin. The same symbol was turned into a warning. Why? Because knowledge is dangerous when it frees people. The church was built on obedience, on faith without question, and the serpent offered the opposite. It said, "Look within, think for yourself, discover truth without permission." The early church fathers knew the old symbols. They studied Egyptian theology. They knew the serpent was once sacred, but instead of keeping that meaning, they buried it. They turned the light-bringer into the deceiver. They did not destroy the serpent, they rebranded it. But pieces of the old truth survived, in secret texts, in Gnostic gospels, in mystical art. Some early Christians believed the serpent in Eden was not the enemy, but the liberator, that it did not bring death, but awareness, that the real trap was ignorance, and the serpent tried to break it. The Vatican called those ideas heresy, burned the scrolls, silenced the voices. But symbols have a way of slipping through cracks. Today the serpent still watches from cathedral carvings, still coils through ancient manuscripts, still waits on the foreheads of forgotten gods. So was it one symbol or two? Maybe it depends on who is holding it. In Egypt, the serpent lifted you up. In Rome, it brought you down. But in the space between those stories, there might be a hidden message. That the path to truth is not always straight. Sometimes it curves, sometimes it coils, sometimes it wears the skin of a snake, and sometimes the thing we fear the most is the thing that could have set us free. Beneath the marble halls of the Vatican lies a place few have seen. It is not a chapel or a tomb. It is not open to tourists. It is hidden, guarded, watched. The Vatican Secret Archive. A vault so deep and so old that even its name is misleading, because what it holds is not just secret, it is forbidden. And inside those shelves, behind locked gates and ancient seals, are said to be scrolls. Egyptian scrolls, never shown to the public, never acknowledged, and never meant to be read. The Vatican says the archive is just a library, a place for historians and popes to study the Church's past. But what they do not say is what kind of past they are protecting. The archive stretches over 50 miles of shelves. Some rooms so deep underground they pass into the foundations of St. Peter's Basilica. There are rumours of chambers lined with gold leaf and climate control systems built not to preserve paper but something older, something sacred. Among the whispers are stories of Egyptian texts taken during church-sponsored expeditions in the 1600s and 1700s. Not relics for display, but full scrolls, written in Coptic, in Demotic, even in early hieroglyphic shorthand. Some say these texts describe rituals never seen outside temple walls, maps of energy inside the human body, prophecies that stretch back before known dynasties, and perhaps most disturbing of all records of a divine teacher born thousands of years before the timeline of Jesus. A teacher who spoke of the light within and the death of death. If true, these scrolls could rewrite everything, not just religion but history. They would show that Egypt was not just a civilization, it was a library, a machine for preserving knowledge about who we are and what we can become. And that knowledge was not lost. It was taken. Why would the Vatican hide this? Because control is easier when the past is silent. When people forget that the earliest forms of Christianity were born in Egyptian soil, that the Desert Fathers learned from the same mystics who worshipped Isis and Horus, that the line between the cross and the Ankh is thinner than we are told. Some who worked in the archives have come forward anonymously. They describe sealed boxes marked with symbols not found in any modern language, scrolls too fragile to touch stored in glass cylinders filled with inert gas, texts that mention stars that do not exist anymore, and cities built long before recorded time. These are not the kinds of things that fit neatly into Sunday sermons. The truth may still be sitting beneath St. Peter's, wrapped in linen, waiting in the dark. And maybe that is where it will stay, because light only spreads when someone is brave enough to lift the veil. Until then, we are left with shadows, with symbols that do not match the stories, with carvings that speak louder than books, and with the quiet knowing that somewhere under Rome, Egypt still breathes. Time feels solid, days, months, years. We trust the calendar without thinking about where it came from. But what if that calendar was designed not to guide us, but to separate us from something much older? Something cosmic. The Church tells us it just corrected the way we measure time. But what it really did was erase the rhythms of Egypt and Babylon, the cycles that once kept humanity in tune with the stars. This was not just a mistake, it was a plan, a quiet rewrite of reality. The ancient Egyptians did not see time as linear. They saw it as a wheel. Life moved in cycles. Birth, death, rebirth. Their calendar followed the flooding of the Nile and the movements of Sirius. When the star rose just before dawn, it marked the start of the new year, a sign of abundance, harmony, cosmic alignment. Babylon did something similar. Their calendar was based on lunar cycles, 13 months, each tied to a phase of the moon. They tracked eclipses and planetary alignments with astonishing accuracy. Their priests knew how to read the sky like a scroll. They believed time was sacred, a language spoken by the stars. Now enter the Church. In the early centuries of Christianity, leaders realized something. To build authority, they had to break from the past. They needed their own holidays, their own beginning. So they started to bend time. The first move was to shift major celebrations. Christmas was placed near the winter solstice. Easter was aligned to the spring equinox, but calculated in a confusing way, so it would no longer match older fertility festivals. Then they rewrote the calendar itself. First came the Julian calendar from Rome. Then later, the Gregorian calendar from the Vatican. Days were added, others were removed. The months were renamed to honour emperors and saints. They even changed the starting point. Year 1 was no longer tied to any natural event. It became the supposed birth of Christ. Even though scholars admit we do not know the exact year, what mattered was not accuracy, it was control. But here is where it gets strange. When you try to align ancient events using the current calendar, things do not match. Eclipses appear in the wrong year. Temples no longer point to the correct stars. Whole periods of history start to feel like they were stretched or compressed. Some researchers call it phantom time, the idea that centuries were added to make certain stories line up. Whether or not time was faked completely, the impact is clear. We are living in a system of time that disconnects us from nature, from the stars, from the wisdom of the ancients. It keeps us on schedule but off balance. And maybe that is the point. A people cut off from true time are easier to shape, easier to forget, easier to leave. But the sky never forgot. The stars are still there, spinning in their perfect rhythm, waiting for us to remember how to read them. And maybe when we do, we will find our way back to the time we were meant to live in. The real time, the sacred time, the time before time was stolen. There are stories that never make the news, discoveries that vanish, experts who suddenly stop speaking, and in the world of Egyptology, that silence is not always natural. Over the years, certain scholars who dug too deep or translated too clearly found themselves cut off, shamed, or worse. Their work dismissed, their names erased. Some believe it was bad luck. Others whisper that it was not an accident, that the Vatican had a hand in it, quietly watching, making sure some truths never reached the surface. Take the case of a linguist who claimed to find direct links between Egyptian texts and early Christian writings. His papers showed that phrases used by Jesus in the Gospels mirrored lines from the Book of the Dead. Not similar ideas, exact phrases. He said it proved that Christianity had roots deep in Egyptian spirituality, that the message was never new, only retold. Within a year, his funding was gone. His publisher dropped him. He died alone in a small apartment. Most of his work unpublished. Then there was an archaeologist who uncovered a series of scrolls in the sands near Abydos. These scrolls spoke of a teacher with a glowing face, a healer who walked across sand as if it were water. But the scroll was dated over 1,000 years before the birth of Jesus. The team was excited until officials arrived. The scrolls were taken for preservation. The dig was shut down. The archaeologist was accused of fraud. Her career ended before the story could be told. This pattern repeats. Scholars discover something that links Egypt and early Christianity, that hints at a shared origin, that shows the church might have borrowed from temples it once called pagan. And every time, the same thing happens. Discredit, silence, vanishing. Why would the Vatican care? Because if these discoveries are real, they would mean the church was built not on divine revelation, but on edited memory. That many of the rituals, symbols, and prayers used today were first spoken in languages the Vatican now pretends are dead. Some brave voices have tried to speak out, writing books, giving interviews. But even now they face pressure. Anonymous letters, sudden legal trouble, mysterious illnesses. It always looks natural, always seems explainable. But when it happens again and again, the pattern is hard to ignore. The Vatican claims to support history. It funds archaeological missions, hosts academic conferences, but only within certain boundaries, only on its terms. The second a discovery steps beyond what the Church has approved, the door slams shut. There is a reason we know so much about the battles of Rome, but so little about the libraries of Egypt. a reason the same few Egyptian texts are taught in schools while others gather dust behind locked Vatican doors. The scholars who tried to change that paid a price. Some with their jobs, some with their names, some with their lives. But silence cannot last forever. Not when the sand keeps shifting. Not when old texts keep surfacing. Not when truth keeps whispering through the cracks. Some saints feel ancient in ways that go beyond the Bible. Their names echo through cathedrals and candles. Their images smile down from stained glass and icons. But look closely, and something feels off. A strange familiarity. A sense that these holy men and women were not entirely new. That maybe they were someone else before, older, Egyptian. And that somewhere between the pyramids and the pulpits, a transformation took place. One the Vatican never talks about. Start with Saint Anthony the Great, often called the father of Christian monasticism. He lived in the Egyptian desert, fought demons, spoke of silence and inner light. But his story matches another desert wanderer, the god Set, a figure who faced chaos alone, who battled darkness in isolation, one rejected by the gods but holding sacred wisdom. The lines blur fast. The names change. The message does not. Then there is Saint Catherine of Alexandria, said to have debated philosophers and converted many with her brilliance. She was martyred for her faith, but her legend overlaps with Isis, the Divine Mother, the patron of wisdom and magic. Both are shown holding wheels. Both guide souls. Both are wrapped in stories of sacrifice and power. When the Church canonized Catherine, they may have been rewriting Isis into a form they could control. Saint George, the dragon slayer, defender of light. His tale is one of courage over chaos. But in Egypt, long before George, there was Horus, the falcon god who battled the serpent Apep, who defended the order of the world against the forces of destruction. George wears armour, Horus wears feathers, but they strike the same pose. It goes on. Saint Michael, with his sword raised against evil, echoes the pose of Anubis. Saint Mary shares symbols with Hathor. Saint John's desert baptism reflects the purification rites of Osiris. These are not just coincidences, they are patterns. Deliberate alignments, pieces of a puzzle hidden in plain sight. The early church faced a challenge. How do you convert a land as ancient and rich as Egypt? You do not erase its gods, you rebrand them. You baptize their legends, you canonize their traits. And slowly, the people forget where the stories came from. The Vatican would say, these are just echoes, archetypes, common threads across cultures. But when the robes match, and the teachings line up, and the symbols repeat, it becomes hard to believe it is all just chance. So the pharaohs became saints, the temples became churches, the sacred stories were wrapped in Latin and given new names. But the power remained, the presence lingered, because truth does not die. It just changes costume, and maybe deep down the church knows. Maybe that is why they keep the oldest texts hidden, why they deny the connections. Because if the saints were once gods, then the line between faith and myth starts to blur. And when that line disappears, so does the control. The saints still shine, their statues still stand, but behind their eyes the desert still watches, and the Nile still remembers. There is a truth buried in the temples of Egypt, a truth older than any church, carved into stone, whispered in sacred halls. The idea that divinity does not sit on a throne in the sky. It burns inside you, that you are not separate from the gods. You are part of them, made from the same light, guided by the same spark. This teaching was the heart of Egyptian spirituality, and it is the very idea the church feared the most. In ancient Egypt, the temples were not just places to pray, they were schools, initiation centers, and the highest teaching was not about worshipping an outside force, it was about awakening the God within. The soul was seen as divine. The journey of life was not just to obey, but to remember who you really are. Every ritual, every symbol, every story pointed inward. The Eye of Horus was not just a mystical symbol, it was a map of the brain, a guide to awakening higher consciousness. The weighing of the heart was not about sin, it was about balance, harmony, tuning your inner self to the frequency of the cosmos. This kind of belief creates strength, it creates freedom, because once you understand that the divine lives within you, no one can control you from outside. You do not need a priest to reach heaven. You do not need a church to speak to God. You only need to look within. And that is exactly what made it dangerous. When the early Christian church began to rise, it needed structure, power, a chain of command. The teachings of inner divinity threatened all of that. If people believed they were divine, they would not bow. They would not fear. They would question. And questioning was not allowed. So the message had to change. Instead of God within, they gave us God above. A distant figure, watching, judging. One who could only be reached through a system, through sacraments, through obedience. The church became the gatekeeper, the only path to salvation. And anyone who taught otherwise was called a heretic. Many of the early Christian mystics still held onto the old ways. The Desert Fathers, the Gnostics. They spoke of light inside the body, of inner knowledge, of becoming one with the divine. But their texts were burned, their names erased, and the Egyptian roots they carried were buried deep. Even today, the idea of God within is seen as rebellious, as dangerous. But the irony is that Jesus himself hinted at it when he said the kingdom of God is within you, when he healed with touch, when he spoke in parables that mirrored Egyptian teachings. The church turned those words into metaphor. Egypt turned them into practice. Maybe that is why the old temples still stand, cracked but unbroken, because they were never just buildings, they were mirrors, reflecting a truth that cannot be silenced forever, that the divine does not live in stone or scripture, it lives in you, waiting, glowing, eternal. What happens when the secrets come back into the light? When the stories hidden under stone and script are finally spoken again? Does the world fall apart? Or does it finally begin to heal? For thousands of years, truth has been buried under cathedrals and sealed behind vaults. It was burned, forgotten, twisted, but not destroyed. And now, after so much silence, the old light begins to flicker again. People are asking questions, real questions, about why ancient temples look like blueprints of the human body, about why Christian saints echo Egyptian gods, about why sacred calendars were rewritten and scrolls locked away. They are not just looking to the sky for answers anymore. They are looking inward, back to where Egypt always told us to look. This is not just about old stories, it is about power, the power to remember. Because memory is the first step to freedom. The church built its strength on forgetfulness, on telling us that truth only comes from outside, from pulpits, from books we are not allowed to question. But the Egyptians knew different. They taught that truth is already inside you, that the divine is not something you must earn, It is something you must uncover. So what happens if the world starts to remember? If the secrets of the pyramids are revealed, not as tombs, but as tools for awakening? If the scrolls hidden under the Vatican are opened and their words allowed to breathe again? If the timelines are corrected and we see that much of what we were told was history was actually design? What happens is a shift, a ripple. People start to walk differently, think differently. They stop looking up in fear and start standing tall. Because remembering who you are changes everything. And that is what they feared the most. They wanted you to forget. But the temples are still standing. The symbols are still carved. The stars still rise in the same rhythms. The knowledge never truly left. It only waited, patiently, like a sun behind a cloud. And now the cloud is moving. It is not too late. That is the lie. That the ancient world is gone. That we are too modern, too scientific, too distracted to care. But it is not true. The light never left. It just went underground. Now it rises again. In the minds of artists, in the hearts of seekers, in the whispers of scholars who risk everything to tell the truth. The return is not loud, not explosive. It is slow and steady, like a dawn. And maybe that is how it always had to be. Not a war, not a revolution, just a remembering. Because, in the end, the greatest secret Egypt left us was this: that we were never separate, never lost, only asleep. And now the light returns.